Welcome. Today we are going to talk about intermittent fasting and its relevance to strength training. It's often thought that strength training cannot go hand in hand with fasting. Today we're going to break that myth. I'm Dr. Saurabh Jindal. I'll take you along today on a journey of why I believe strength training is so vital to your health and how you can mix fasting with intermittent fasting with strength training. I firmly believe that everyone is a bodybuilder. Now, why do I say that? Now, when I say bodybuilder, people believe that word really means that somebody's got big bulging muscles and he's a bodybuilder, is participating in competitions. No, that's not how I look at it. Everybody is responsible for the body that they have built. So everybody is a bodybuilder conceptually. That means that if you have basically given a carbohydrate priority in your diet and your nourishment and your nutrition, you will basically be making a lot of fat in your body. So basically, carbohydrate priority means fat mass priority in your body. On the other hand, if your diet would basically be more accustomed towards a protein intake, and a protein is a priority in your nutrition, then you will make muscle as a priority in your body. So this is a decision that all of us either knowingly or unknowingly make. Whether we are towards the carb side or the protein side basically defines what happens inside you. Now we have to understand that fat mass, the more fat mass you have, the more unhealthier you would be, and the more muscle you would have, the healthier you would be. In fact, there's a big surge of something called as metabolic syndrome in the world. Metabolic syndrome is a term that is basically applied for a group of disorders, and that group of disorders include obesity, basically abdominal obesity, includes hypertension, includes heart disease, includes Alzheimer's disease, for example, includes lipid problems and high triglycerides, high cholesterol. So those things basically put together are called as metabolic syndromes. And central to metabolic syndrome is loss of muscle. When the muscle is lesser, then the body will prioritize fat deposition. And that fat deposition leads to all these things which are included in the term metabolic syndrome. So today's lecture will tell you why protein is so important for us, especially when somebody does intermittent fasting. Whenever intermittent fasting lectures are heard by people, what comes across in the listener is, okay, carbohydrate should be lowered, That's the message which goes through, which is the correct message. But the problem is that message has a second part of the sentence, and the second part is make protein a priority, make fat intake a priority. That somehow is lost in the entire focus on lowering the carbohydrates. So if you lower your carbohydrates but don't proportionately have more proteins and fats, then the entire intermittent fasting will be a negative thing for you to do, and that will not give you all the benefits that we want from it. Now, all of us are basically in a stage of glucose excess. We are just having too much of glucose in our system. We'll call it energy excess. That means what? Let's say in the night when you're sleeping, you're fasting. When you're fasting, obviously you're not eating, so not too much of energy is coming in from outside. In the morning, when you get up, it's very common for all of us to jump and have breakfast because we are just accustomed to feel and we have been trained to think that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. That is now being challenged. And I can tell you that's not true. In fact, breakfast is not the most important meal of the day. That's the first myth I want to break. In fact, if you are not to have that morning meal and you were to push that overnight fasting longer, you would be more benefiting from that skipping of the breakfast than actually taking it. I'll tell you why it is so detrimental to have multiple meals in a day. It's a common myth that you should be eating every few hours. But then what happens with that? There's too much of energy coming in. We don't need so much of energy, okay? Because our body is so designed that we are okay. Body is designed to have a few meals a day, but not so much. Let's give you an example. I'll give you an analogy to get across this point. Look at this. This is basically a sink, and there's a tap which is putting in water into the sink. Now think of this water as actually glucose. So that's the morning breakfast that you have taken. So glucose comes in, the sink is your body, sink is your cell, right? Which is absorbing that glucose in the morning when you have breakfast. You have breakfast in the morning. After 1 or 2 hours, you maybe have a little bit of beverage. You have some coffee, you have some tea, you put some sugar into it. You have a mid-morning snack. There's more glucose coming in. So again, the water comes in. Again, the afternoon lunch. Again, a snack in the evening. Again, a dinner at night. Maybe a bedtime tea or something. So there are multiple glucose insults, so to speak, coming in. So too much of water is flowing into the sink. Now, sink has a limited capacity. We don't have unlimited space in our cells. Cells will say, okay, I'm full of energy, I don't need so much of glucose, but that tap is open throughout the day. So we're eating so much that our tap is just not closing. There's too much energy coming into the system. What will happen? The sink will overflow, as you can see in the image, and that overflowing glucose will get converted into fat. So glucose doesn't get stored as glucose in the body. Okay, glucose first gets stored as glycogen, but the glycogen is not too much of storage capacity. So ultimately, we'll go to the bigger storage capacity, which is fat. We have a lot of storage capacity in the fat tissue, like adipocytes. So the glucose ultimately becomes fat. So you have to understand that throughout the day, when you keep on putting glucose, you are basically becoming obese, and that fat is getting deposited in almost all places. And it will get deposited in places where it's not supposed to go. For example, it will go into your liver. It's not supposed to go there. But because there's so much of glucose coming in, you need storage sites. So abdomen is one place. You will find a bulging abdomen, a waist size increasing. Liver gets filled up with fat, which is called fatty liver. Your heart vessels get filled up. Your endothelium, the inner lining of your blood vessels of the heart, get damaged with that, and you get deposition. You get so many places. The brain gets deposition of this abnormal fat. You have so many problems with this deposit, and that is the reason for ill health and metabolic syndrome. So we call this a stage of energy excess, and that is the fat deposits that we have. Now this fat is getting deposited in as the storage form, which is triglycerides inside your adipocyte. This is adipocyte I've shown you, with a nucleus at the edge. So the cell is filled up with triglycerides. So your fat cells are bulging. It's trying to hold in that extra fat which has come in. I told you the problem with fatty liver. These are livers getting stuffed with fat, which is a very, very bad thing. Liver is such an important, vital part of your system. Imagine hitting your liver and damaging it, not by alcohol, but by fat. This is called as non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is one of the commonest things that we see, and this will progress further in some cases to fibrosis and cirrhosis and liver failure, needing a liver transplant. Cancers, liver cancers can come from there. So the genesis of all these problems is just too much of glucose coming into the system. Now when I say glucose, in your mind you should not only think of it as just some sugar that you're actually taking, the table sugar. No, that is sugar, agreed. But there are so many other forms of sugar which are not even visible to you. For example, carbohydrates. Okay, you have a bread. Okay, you have these bread slices, you have biscuits, you have cakes. They go in and they actually get converted to glucose itself. So when I say glucose, I only don't mean things which taste sweet. It includes everything which ultimately is getting converted to glucose, which is basically carbohydrate. So that's why a low carbohydrate diet is a good thing to follow. The same I told you, same fat and same is going to get deposited in the blood vessels of your coronary arteries, of your heart vessels, blocking them. You go to a doctor, they'll say, okay, there's a lot of blockage. Let's open it up. Let's do an angioplasty. Let's do a bypass. Now, would you realize that that is treatment after the disease has happened? Would you not want to prevent the formation of these? Would that be prevented by exercise? Not really. The most effective way of preventing these deposits in your heart and keeping your heart healthy is to have a low carbohydrate diet. So having a low glucose, low carbohydrate diet basically is a nutritional angioplasty, so to speak. You're basically removing those things. So it's good not to really get into the operational and the procedural side, but to prevent it obviously from happening in the first place. It's again a common myth that LDL cholesterol, which is in media called the bad cholesterol, it's a myth that LDL is creating these deposits. LDL is just a bystander. Don't think of LDL as a male culprit here. The culprit is actually the energy excess and the glucose excess, which is actually creating the problem, and the LDL just comes on top of it. So LDL doesn't cause it by itself. LDL is just someone who comes in after it sees a problem of the inner lining, and that lining problem happens to the glucose issue that we spoke about. Okay, so lowering LDL cholesterol is not really the way to prevent heart disease. It has to be much more. It has to be more regulating the glucose coming in. And how does glucose and fat deposition happen? With a very classical, I told you, metabolic syndrome, right? All this metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome has a single baseline pathology, which is common to all metabolic syndromes, and that is insulin resistance. So if you check your fasting insulin in the laboratory, then you will find that fasting insulin is higher. And that is basically the insulin not working very well. So the pancreas has to really push in more more insulin. And that basically is called insulin resistance. So everything, all this is a pattern and a disease process and resulting from insulin resistance. Now, so that means we'll just summarize this. If you have a high carbohydrate diet, your fat cells will bulge, your fat cells are expanding, and you get metabolic syndrome with obesity, heart disease, hypertension, dementia, polycystic ovarian disease is such a common problem with infertility, fatty liver. Everything comes from bulging fat cells and a lot of fat deposits. On the other hand, it's very common for people to have a low protein diet. And that's a normal thing. We see a lot of people having a lot of focus on carbs, but not having too much of focus on proteins. So they're not having too much of proteins throughout the day. They also don't do strength training. And then what happens is the muscle is really thin. Now, muscle being thin and fat cells being big is the major determinant of the modern epidemic of metabolic syndrome. So metabolic syndrome is not only driven by high carbohydrates, it's also being driven by low muscle power, low muscle strength, and having a dietary problem with proteins. Now, the fat cells I told you are bulging, and that fat is getting deposited in your abdomen. So most people who have abdominal size which is very, very, very big, okay, that's abdominal obesity, which is a marker of visceral fat. There's a lot of fat inside the abdomen, which is going to be contributing to this. Even though I may admit that a lot of fat people can be healthy as well, but most fat people, almost 80%, would have a lot of trouble inside. Now, this fat layer is the trouble. Along with this, they have poor muscles. So it's a double whammy. More fat, very bad muscles. We call this sarcopenic obesity. Sarcopenic means low muscle strength, and obesity is the fat getting deposited. So if you see this now, the yellow part is the fat, which we can obviously see, and the red is the muscle. So the muscle, the abdominal muscles and the body muscles are weak, and a lot of fat layer on top, and that is the prevalent issue, and this is driving the entire epidemic of metabolic syndrome. Now, it's very important to understand that the more carbohydrate you take, the more hungry you will be. So when people focus more on carbohydrates, in fact, they will feel hungry every few hours. So why would people eat 6-7 times in a day? Because every meal is carbohydrate. In fact, that is why protein meals are so good. Because the more proteins you take in your diet, the more fats you take in your diet, you will have less hunger. So we always believe that if a meal fails to reduce your hunger for many hours, for example, if you have breakfast, let's say you don't feel hungry for 6 hours, that's a good breakfast. But what happens is that only happens if you take a lot of proteins and fats in your breakfast. If you take cereals, if you take sugar, it does not help you because you will feel hungry very soon. So one very good marker of whether you're having a good diet or no is to measure how soon do you feel hungry after a meal. If you feel hungry very soon, something is wrong. So you have to understand hunger determines obesity, right? The more hungry you are, the more obese you will be. So don't think of obesity as a fat problem. Obesity is ultimately a brain issue, okay? Why would I say it's a brain issue? Because we are addicted to carbohydrate intake. So it is an emotional component of eating. Also, you feel hungry, okay? And that hunger hormone gets released too frequently. And that's why you keep on eating a lot. In fact, there's a hunger hormone called as leptin, which is released by your fats and with your fat cells. So if you have a lot of protein intake and a lot of fat intake, you will have higher leptin. That means more satiety. You will not feel hunger. So prioritize protein intake because of hunger element as well. So, and if you have a low carbohydrate diet, how can you have that? Do intermittent fasting. I have many videos on my YouTube channel on how to do intermittent fasting. I would welcome you to go and see that. Intermittent fasting will, and along with a focus on having a low carbohydrate diet, will cause the fat cells to release that fat for energy production, because there's not carbohydrate is not coming in, you are fasting, your body needs energy, so there's no energy access. In fact, it's basically the energy is lesser in the system, right? There's minimal energy, but you have a lot of stored energy, which is the triglycerides, which is going to be used up and it's going to be liquefied. It's now going to give you that energy which you need. So you will not feel that internally the body has automatically reversed your engine. It's using fats to give you energy, and this obviously will make you thinner, and that's a very good way of losing weight. And the moment you reduce your fat deposition, you will have metabolic benefits out of that, and that will be reversal of a lot of problems of heart disease and diabetes. All these type 2 diabetes, all these can be definitely reversed, especially in the early cases with intermittent fasting. Along with that, I would want you to focus on a high protein diet and strength training. So is it not the opposite of what's happening now? So we want low carbohydrate and high proteins, and that will build you a muscle, and this muscle will help you also with the same weight loss and metabolic benefits. So that's why my encouragement to do both. Do a high protein diet and strength training to combine with that. In fact, if I were to choose one exercise for you between cardio and strength training, it's better to do strength training rather than cardio, because this will give you more metabolic benefits. So what would I want people to do? If I have fat and the red was the muscle, you want to build muscle by the muscle building exercises, which is the strength training. You can do body weight training, where you join the gym and do a dumbbell training, or with machines. This is not going to be enough. However, you have to lose the fat as well, and that fat loss happens with intermittent fasting. So the best way really to boost everything is remove the fat, increase your muscle, and that is with combination of intermittent fasting and strength training. Now, muscle growth versus metabolic syndrome, they are two completely separate things. If your body will always be in either the left side or the right side, it can't be on both. So if your body is having a lot of muscle growth, then the metabolic syndrome disease plus possibility is lesser. And if you're on the right side, then your muscle growth is paralyzed, or muscle growth is not so much. So it will be either on these left side or right side. If you are prioritizing muscle growth by protein intake and strength training, what will happen? The more muscle strength you have, the more longevity you would have. Basically, you have to understand muscle is an investment. Like all of us have medical insurance, that lest we fall sick, you will want people to help you with finances. Why would you not want to have a medical insurance with muscle? Think of muscle as life insurance, meaning it will serve you in the long term. Invest in your muscle. It's an investment. It will give you great returns. Build muscle. Think of muscle as a sink. What is a sink? Sink is an absorber of things, right? So think of muscle as something which absorbs glucose. So that glucose excess, which is a part of daily living, that is going to be absorbed by that muscle. It's going to use up that glucose, and that glucose will not then spill over into fat. So muscle increases insulin sensitivity, meaning insulin, I told you insulin resistance is the main problem with every disease of metabolic syndrome. So will it not be great for your insulin to work better in your system? So that's called insulin sensitivity. And if you have insulin sensitivity, you will be very easily disposing that excess glucose and energy, and muscles do that. It increases insulin sensitivity. The more muscle you have, the lower insulin you will have. You have to know that this is a very important hormone, insulin, which is released by your pancreas. The lower insulin you have, the healthier you will be. And the higher insulin you have, the more unhealthy you will be. In fact, almost all type 2 diabetics have high insulin levels, and that's why they are type 2 diabetics, okay? Because their insulin is not working. So you want to lower insulin. So in fact, it is very good for diabetics to start working out, to start making muscle, because they will lower their insulin with that. And the lower insulin you have, the lower fat you have. So both of them run together. Lower the insulin, the lower the fat. And that is what you want. You want basically that to be done. So it is, and they are obviously prioritizing proteins and training. Whereas what happens in people who have metabolic syndrome, they have very low muscle strength and low longevity. In fact, because they have low muscle, they have insulin resistance. So they are not able to dispose of glucose easily like how they should. They have very high insulin levels and they have high fat mass. So I told you insulin and fat go together, right? So when they have high insulin, they have high fat mass, and that's why they're obese, and that's why they have disease. And they have basically prioritized carbohydrates in their diet. So if you want, if you're on the right side, always try to go to the left side. It'll give you great metabolic benefits. Now, this is something that I like to say a lot. Whenever you have whatever number of calories that you take in your body, what happens to those calories? Let's say you take 2000 calories in your diet. Now, out of those 2000 calories, 70% is going to be used up for basal metabolic rate, the green part. Now, the green part indicates all the energy that is used up for basically your heart function, your brain function, your lung function, your kidney function, making urine, digestion, everything basically is in the basal metabolic rate. So what happens is you will lose, out of 2000, you will use basically 1400 calories just for maintaining your life. So that is the energy being spent by your system at rest. That is like when you're watching TV, this much is anyway getting utilized. The red part is the physical activity, which is contributing 20% of that energy usage. So if you run, if you exercise, so you will lose 20% out of that 2000 calorie that you've taken, that is used up for physical activity. And 10% is used for thermogenesis, meaning heat production. Basically, this is the energy that you will use to digest the food that you have taken. Because see, food digestion also takes energy. So 70% is used by BMR, basal metabolic rate, 20%, 10%. So now do you realize the basic energy usage, the main energy usage is by BMR, right? So no matter how much marathons you run, how much energy you would spend by exercise, the exercise only is that 20%. That's not too much of energy burning anyway. So the basic BMR is what determines how much energy you would use. And it's amazing to realize that muscle building, the more muscle you have, the more BMR you will have. You are going to increase the major burning furnace, which is your BMR. So your 70% BMR, that is going to become higher and higher and higher. So you will burn more energy at rest. So the more muscle you have, the more energy you burn while watching TV, while not doing anything. Will that not be a great thing? So we don't really want to move too much to spend that energy. You want to just build muscle, and that will give you all the benefits. So get this example. The stronger muscles you have, the more lifting that you do, the more strain you put on your muscles, the more resistance exercises that you do, the bigger furnace you have, you will burn energy more efficiently, and you will have obviously more benefits out of that. And if you don't prioritize your muscle and your poor muscle strength, which is so common as you grow older, it's very common for people to have sarcopenia, which is loss of muscle, and they have lower furnaces, meaning small candle furnace, so not too much of energy being burnt inside, so they tend to gain weight because of that. So in fact, poor muscle and fat gain, do you realize both of them again would go together? Because you're just not burning too much. So it's very common for people as they near their middle age, right, 30s, 40s, 50s, you will find that they are gaining weight, because by that time they are not really doing too much about the muscle part. Muscle is going less, and your furnace is becoming lesser, and your fat deposits become more. So you can reverse that by focusing more on the muscle. Your furnace would be burning that much brighter. Now get this example. There's a track, you are here, and you want to see whether you want to go to the straight track or the right side. Now if you basically have a lot of proteins, a lot of strength training, you will go straight. And this straight line is the healthier path, because it gives you muscle, low chance of metabolic syndrome. But if you are to prioritize the right side, which is a lot of carbohydrates and no training, no weight training, and it's a very common myth that females shy away from weight training. It's very common that males usually are there in the muscle building section of a gymnasium, and the females are there in the cardio section of that, which is the wrong way of looking at it. Females should definitely be doing strength training. Do not worry, you will not build up those muscles which like a male would. Don't worry about it. It's very important that you have muscle strength. Females need to have a lot of muscle strength because muscle strength determines bone strength as well. So that's why it's called musculoskeletal system. Muscular part and the skeletal part gives you the strength that you would need. As you grow older, menopausal, you will have a lot of issues with strength, lot of problems there, and then you would gain fat, you would have heart disease. So best to not go that side, not go on the right side, that means. And if you have a lot of carbs, you will obviously have muscle loss and high chances for metabolic. So it's our choice which route we want to take. What would I do if I were obese? I would think like a muscle builder and train. That's the first thing I want to do if I have a lot of abdominal weight. So this will build up glucose burning capacity. I just burn that glucose which I'm taking. Second is I want to start intermittent fasting, reduce the carbs. So I'm reducing the input of glucose into the system. So I'm doing both. So I'm doing input reduction and I'm increasing the burning capacity. In fact, I would always recommend people who do intermittent fasting should always do muscle building and have high protein, because if you focus only on intermittent fasting as the only way to boost your health, then you're putting too much of energy into just intermittent fasting, and you go on vacation for like 10 days, 15 days, and you come off the wagon and you stop doing intermittent fasting for a month, you have a risk of the entire problem coming back. And that's why if you do only IF without training, and if you get back to all the carbs, all the ill effects come back. So it's almost as if having a muscle as a second line of defense against disease. First line of defense is the intermittent fasting. Add muscle building, both together give you two gates, which will then, it's difficult to open both gates together for the disease to come in. So close both the gates. Do a fasting closure, and the muscle building also is one more gate. Now what is intermittent fasting? What's going to do? See this. Can you see this now? I've shown you that sink example. The water, we have reduced the water coming in. So there's less water, and that's intermittent fasting. Low carbohydrate meal will just empty your sink because not too much of water is coming in. Whereas what is muscle building doing? Muscle building is increasing the size of the sink. So the muscle building and the intermittent fasting together is a great combination to have. One is increasing the sink, one is reducing the water coming in. So how do I now that you understand the concept of muscle building and why it's so important, I always recommend doing strength training and cardio in a fasting state. This is where it has the most benefits. It's a myth that you need to have a big pre-workout meal and all that stuff. It's not required. We really need more fasting training, and fasting cardio really benefits, and I'll show you where it's benefiting. People ask me, where would the energy be coming from? During the strength training, I'll feel dizzy, I'll feel that. No, that's not true. I'll tell you why it's so good to do fasted exercise and fasted cardio. Now look at the amount of stores that you have in your body for energy. Blood glucose, about 40 calories of energy. Not too much of energy is there in the blood itself. So once you use that up, you would look at the liver glycogen, which is about 300. So that's one more storage form. Again, not too much of calories there. Then there's a lot of glycogen in muscle, about 2000 calories. So first point is you have a lot of stored energy anyway. So that is what most people will use first. Let's assume that is also used up. And you will say, okay, now what do I have? Then there's a lot of fat inside your muscle. This is called as intramuscular triglyceride. This fat gives you almost double, 4000 calories. So these are all internal sources. You don't need that external banana before your exercise, before your marathons. Not required. You have plenty of stores inside. And for anyone who looks at how a muscle looks, this is how the muscle fibers are, and the black arrow points to the fat in between the muscle planes. And that is what is the muscle triglyceride. It's going to be used up for energy. A lot of energy is there in that. So that is what is often used up. Let's assume you use up that as well. This is also used up. Now you have actually adipose tissue. The fat cell itself, 1 lakh, more than 1 lakh calories there, right there. And that is why you have this much fat which you're going to use. So do you realize the number of sources of energy that you have inside? Why do you want to look at just an external source of fuel? You have so much inside, and this fat usage only happens if you do exercise in a fasting stage. Otherwise, it does not happen. The moment you eat and go, you will not be able to use this fat from inside, because the body says, oh, there's a lot of energy from outside. Why should I now tap into my internal resources? I'll use what is there from outside. It's a more convenient fuel, but don't do that. You want to burn up the fat. That's why you're exercising in the first place. So that's a great thing to do. So look at it this way. Now look at a truck like this. It's got two fuel sources. One is the smaller fuel source that is powering this, and the bigger fuel source which also it's carrying. Now would I not want to use the bigger fuel source, right? I don't want to use the small fuel source. So what happens is most people have only a tendency to use the smaller fuel sources, which are the glycogens and the external food that they have consumed, but that's not too much of energy. The internal fat is the bigger source of energy, which is what you need to tap into, and that happens only in a fasted stage. And that is why do your strength training in a fasted stage. It's really benefiting you by mobilizing the internal body fats. So internal, and you would say, okay, how does the fat fuel us? How does the fat contribute to muscle strength, and how does it help in muscle building? Triglycerides get converted to fatty acids in the fasting stage. So if you're doing intermittent fasting, it goes into fatty acids, goes to the liver and becomes ketones. This ketones really goes into the muscle, and that ketone is fueling the muscles. The triglycerides also start getting converted to glycerol. It gets converted to glycerol, and that glycerol also gets into glucose conversion, and that ultimately also goes to muscle. So you can actually make your glucose inside. You can also make ketones. Both together is fueling those muscles. Ketone is a very good fuel for your muscles, so there's no need really to depend on external fuel sources. Also, intermittent fasting will boost something called as growth hormone. This GH, growth hormone, also fuels your muscles. So would you now realize that there's so much of chemicals inside which are internal supports for your muscles? Don't really go for external fuel sources. Rely on growth hormones, rely on ketones like beta hydroxybutyrate. You have glucose coming in from the internal fat, a lot of benefit from there. What do I recommend after exercise? I recommend that you should eat after exercise, especially if you're doing strength training. You want to build your muscles, because during exercise and strength training, you are damaging the muscles, and the muscles are hungry to repair themselves. So what happens? I've told you that you should exercise in a fasting stage. In a fasting stage, you have very low insulin, right? And then you exercise. And then once you come back, you should eat. You should have a good high protein diet, good quality protein, and your insulin is going to shoot up. I means insulin. This boosted up, shot up insulin will allow the muscles to be repaired. So the proteins which you have taken in the diet then goes into muscles because of high insulin, and that will repair your muscles. So we'll always recommend exercise at the end of the fasting period. So let's assume you fast for 16 hours in intermittent fasting, work out in the 16th hour, come back, and within 1 hour have a good high protein diet, and that will help refuel and repair those muscles, and that will basically give you all the benefits of fasting also and strength training. Both get benefited at the same place. How much protein would we need? We need about 1.2 to 1.5 gram per kg per day of ideal body weight. So this is not the body weight that you have right now. It is what it should be. So calculate your ideal body weight, get to 1.2 to 1.5 gram per kg. That's more than the advocated reference range, because in intermittent fasting we need a bit more protein intake. It's not harmful. It is good to have this much. How do I get those proteins? You want to use whole foods as much as possible. I'm not really a big fan of powdered protein. It's always better to have non-processed things in your diet as much as possible. Have whole foods as much as possible to fill up your protein requirement. But just in case you are not able to do that, let's assume you're a vegetarian and you don't even consume eggs. Sometimes it is difficult to fill up your protein requirement. I'm not saying it is impossible. A lot of people are vegetarians and they can still very easily fulfill their protein requirements. But just in case you calculate that you are not able to do it, then you can go to whey protein. Though it's processed, you should have non-sweetened whey, and that is still going to be filling up your protein requirement. If somebody is a vegan, you would then want to use a soybean protein or a pea protein powder. Basic pointers: as much as possible, fill your protein requirement with whole foods. Otherwise, you can have the powder form as well. Now, there's a debate of plant versus animal protein. Now, the thing with plant versus animal protein that I feel is every choice, I believe, should not only be made from only a nutritional perspective. We also need to look at the environment perspective of any protein that we really want to take. Now, this is basically how the impact on the environment is of different protein sources that we have. Now, let's look at the low impact foods. Wheat, corn. Now, that's something that we never recommend during the low carbohydrate, so that is we can cross that off. Beans, chickpeas, lentils, excellent low impact foods, full of proteins, vegetarian proteins, so we expect a lot of people to be taking that as much as possible, and also not very expensive. Rice, not advocated as a part of a low carbohydrate diet. Fish, soy, nuts, eggs. So these are again sources of proteins that are low impact proteins on the environment. We can prioritize that, and if you're a vegetarian, get a soy, get nuts, get your beans. The medium intensity is poultry, pork, and dairy. Dairy, milk, cheese are medium intensity on the environment. So these are your choices that you have, and beef and lamb and goat have extreme impact on the environment. So if we are environmentally conscious, we would kind of want to choose also from that perspective, not only from just a nutritional protein perspective. Now, what are the protein good sources that we have? We have milk, but if you are obese, we don't want you to take too much of milk. It's full of carbohydrates along with proteins, so it's best to take, rather than plain milk, you should take milk products, dairy products like cheese. You can take paneer. These are better to take as compared, or curd, for example. These are fermented things, also help your gut microbiome. Milk, if you're obese, we would not want you to really take too much of the intact milk. Now, nuts are very good again as a high protein source for vegetarians. You can have almonds, walnuts. You can have a lot of these seeds, pumpkin seeds, sunflower seeds, chia seeds, flax seeds. You can have these seeds as well as a part of a high protein meal. You can have a lot of these pulses. You can have chickpeas, you can have beans, you can have chana, you can have all these. These are very, very moong dal, for example. These are good sources of vegetarian sources of proteins. And this is just a chart I made on the amount of proteins we have in vegetarian meals: dals, beans, dairy, good paneer, curd. For vegetables, soybeans, peas, quinoa. These are all vegetarian good sources of protein: spinach, broccoli, mushroom, soy milk, and nuts and seeds. So this is basically a way to get these proteins very easily, even in a vegetarian diet. Now, you can have a lot of millets. Millets also good sources of proteins, though they're also having a lot of carbohydrates inside. And that's the thing with vegetarian food. A lot of vegetarian foods have proteins combined with carbohydrates. So you have to be a bit careful with the amount of carbohydrates you consume alongside when you're wanting to consume a lot of proteins in a vegetarian food. You can have foxtail millet, proso millets, or you can have quinoa, and that will give you a good protein balance as well. So ideal would be to have a low carb and a high protein diet. That would be the ideal way of looking at it. So because that also gives you a bit of low carb focus and a high protein focus. What would that be? Eggs. One of the best foods that way when it comes to basically packing with proteins and fats, the healthy fats. So don't shy away from using the yellow part. That's good to take, and it's almost zero carbs for you to take. You can have soybean milk. These are low carbs and high protein meals. You can have dairy, as I said, dairy products, what I meant. You can use that. Cheese is good for that matter. You can have tofu, you can have nuts, walnuts for that matter. These are low carb and high protein, so it gives you both. It gives you a muscle focus and a fat focus. Both will be helpful. So if you're a vegan, you want to have low carb and high protein still, then you can continue with your soy. You can have tofu, walnuts, and you can just put in some protein powders, then depending on your pea protein or soybean protein powder. But as far as possible, fill up your protein requirements. So with this, we understood overall why it's so important to have proteins along with doing strength training. Now, strength training is so easily done even in your own house. And that is done, you can do basically a lot of videos are there on YouTube on body weight strength. You can use your body weight to exercise in your own house, or you can go to the gym, you can start working out, you can give muscles progressive trauma in the sense that you can give them the challenge, you can keep on increasing the dumbbell size and the weight. So progressively you can increase your muscle strength that way. So I always encourage good protein intake and good amount of muscle training exercises. This is me signing off now. Dr. Saurabh Jindal. This is my attempt to change the world 1 kilo at a time. God bless.